The morning arrived hard and white over Clearwater Executive Airfield, 6:43 a.m. The kind of hour that sorted people, those who ran the world, from those who were run over by it. Daniel Carter pulled his 2007 Camry into the maintenance lot and cut the engine. The idle had been rattling for 3 weeks. He knew exactly what it was, a cracked heat shield on the secondary exhaust manifold, and he also knew he wouldn't fix it this week because Emma's school shoes had needed replacing, and the school shoes had won. He sat there for a moment, with his hands on the steering wheel, looking at the tarmac. The Camry's left rear door still had a drawing taped inside the window. A crayon airplane, red and crooked, with the words, "Dad's work," written underneath in Emma's careful, enormous handwriting. She was 8, and she believed in him without qualification, which was the only thing in his life that felt entirely clean. He got out, tucked the thermos under his arm. He was 34. He had a face that people sometimes described as serious when they meant tired, and blue eyes that some people found unsettling when they noticed how little he missed. He was wearing a gray button-down, untucked, and work boots that had been resoled twice. His ID badge read D. Carter Maintenance Support in block letters. He walked toward the hangar. He was 50 yards from the entrance when the convoy arrived. 3 black SUVs, smooth, coordinated, the kind of arrival that expected the world to adjust. They swept into the private terminal forecourt, and the doors opened in practice sequence, and then Victoria Aldridge stepped out into the morning, like she owned the specific column of air she was standing in. Which, in a functional sense, she did. Victoria Aldridge was 36, the founder and CEO of Aldridge Aviation Systems, a company that had redesigned the avionics interface on 22% of all commercial aircraft, currently certified for domestic U.S. operations. Forbes had covered her twice. She had been named one of the 40 under 40 for 3 years running. She wore a charcoal blazer over a white shirt, and she had the kind of posture that came not from ballet lessons but from never having needed to make herself smaller. She did not look at the maintenance lot. Her assistant, a young man named Preston, moved ahead of her with a tablet and a wired earpiece, and the expression of someone who had slept for 5 hours and was trying to appear as though that number were a choice rather than a condition. "The flight crew is ready," Preston said. "Takeoff window is 7:15. Mr. Hartwell's team in Zurich confirmed the 10 a.m. slot. For the preliminary, I know the slot, Preston. Yes. I also know that we haven't done the final walkthrough on the G700. And I want the port side avionics panel pulled before I board. Already requested." She was walking as she spoke, crossing the forecourt, when she happened to glance toward the maintenance lot. The Camry. She stopped. It was not an intentional stop. It was involuntary. The way the eye is drawn to something incongruous. The Camry sat low on its suspension, one side slightly more than the other, and the exhaust pipe was held in place by what appeared to be a length of steel wire. There was a small dent above the right rear wheel arch. The windshield had a crack, starting from the lower left corner, that someone had stopped with a single strip of clear tape. Preston, who had been walking and speaking and now noticed he was speaking to empty air, turned. "Something wrong? That car." Victoria looked at it for another moment. "That car is somehow on this property." "Maintenance staff," Preston said, checking his tablet. Do they park in the maintenance lot, or do they park directly in my eyeline on the day of the Hartwell presentation? "The maintenance lot and your eyeline are, technically, the same." "Preston, yes. Never mind." She turned back toward the terminal. Then, without looking back at the car, she said, not loudly but clearly enough to carry, "Somebody should tell whoever drives that thing that it's an aviation facility, not a junkyard." 2 of her security detail were close enough to hear. One of them glanced at the Camry and said nothing. The other one, younger, pressed his lips together briefly. 40 feet away, at the edge of the maintenance lot. Daniel Carter had heard every word. He didn't move, didn't adjust his expression. He watched her walk toward the terminal entrance with the particular stillness of a man who has learned that reactions have costs, and that the calculation is almost never worth it. He looked at his Camry. The steel wire on the exhaust pipe. The taped crack. Emma's crayon airplane on the rear window. He picked up his thermos and walked to the hangar. Inside, the Gulfstream G700 sat under the lighting with its panels open and its access hatches raised, and it was the most beautiful piece of engineering Daniel Carter had ever hated. He looked at it for a long time. Then he went to find Tommy Reeves, the shift supervisor, and clocked in for the day. "Do they let you inside it?" Emma was eating cereal at the kitchen table, and the question came between spoonfuls with the focused seriousness she brought to most things. "Inside what?" "The airplanes." "At work." Daniel poured coffee. "Sometimes. Do you fix them?" He looked at her over the rim of the mug. She had her mother's hair straight and dark, and his eyes, which she had somehow inherited, without his tendency toward silence. She filled every quiet space with sound. He was grateful for it. "Sometimes," he said again. "My friend Clara says her dad is a pilot." Emma considered this. "But that's not the same as fixing them." "Fixing them is more important, I think." "Why do you think that?" "Because if nobody fixed them, the pilots wouldn't have anything to fly." He sat down across from her. Outside, the morning was brightening toward blue. He thought about the G700, about the portside avionics panel, about the way the maintenance log had 3 separate entries for an intermittent FBW control surface feedback error that the Aldridge team's technicians had each marked inspected. No fault found, which was either incompetence or something worse. He had noticed it the previous day. During his first week at Clearwater, working the early shift in a role several grades below what his qualifications warranted, he had noticed it the way he always noticed things. Without announcement, without drama, just the quiet filing away of a fact that didn't align. He had put it in the log. His note read, "FBWCS, feedback loop. Possible input handling misalignment between primary and backup channels. Recommend diagnostic before extended flight." Nobody had responded to it. The shift supervisor, Tommy Reeves, had seen the note and said, "That's outside your remit, Danny," with the apologetic tone of a man who meant it. Tommy was a decent man in the specific way that people are decent when decency costs them. Nothing in particular he was fair about overtime. He didn't take credit for other people's work, and he left people alone when they were quiet. But Tommy's career had been built on not making waves in water that other people owned, and that was a kind of decency too, one that just had a different cost structure. Daniel had nodded and returned to his workbench. The thing about knowing something that other people don't want to know is that you are always left with the same options. Say it again louder. Write it into a formal record. Or carry it. The first two had already failed him once in a permanent and comprehensive way. The third was what you did when the first two produced consequences that didn't allow for a fourth option. He carried it. He carried it through the next 12 hours of his shift, through the drive home, through the grocery store where he spent 19 minutes deciding between 2 brands of pasta sauce, while a woman behind him waited with heroic patience, through the bedtime routine where Emma demanded one more chapter of a book about a girl who trained dolphins and would accept no substitutes, and through the 40 minutes after Emma was asleep, when Daniel sat at the kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and wrote out the fault parameters from memory, and then sat back and looked at what he'd written. 0.3 milliseconds of variance. Rising over a 72-hour monitoring period in the FBW backup channel's feedback timing loop, which was the redundancy system, the thing that was supposed to catch what the primary missed. When the redundancy system developed a fault, you did not simply have a fault. You had the illusion of a working aircraft. He folded the legal pad and put it in the drawer where he kept Emma's artwork and important documents and a photograph of his parents from 1987. "Emma," Daniel said, "eat faster or you'll miss the bus." She looked at the clock, performed a rapid calculation, and decided the situation was manageable. "Dad?" "Yes. Do you like your job?" He thought about this with more seriousness than the question probably required. "I'm good at it," he said finally. Emma seemed to accept this as a form of answer. "Clara's dad says he loves his job. He says when he's flying, it feels like being free. That's a good way to feel. Is there something you feel like that? When you're working?" Daniel looked at his hands, broad across the knuckle, A scar on the right index finger from a component test bench 3 years ago, in a different life. Yeah, he said. When something's broken, and then it isn't. That moment. Right then. Emma nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already suspected. She finished her cereal. At Clearwater that morning, Daniel learned that Victoria Aldridge's flight to Zurich had been moved to 9 a.m. The Hartwell deal, $340 million in defense avionics contracts, contingent on a face-to-face demonstration, had an accelerated timeline. He also learned that the G700's FBW diagnostic had been signed off at 6 a.m. by Aldridge's head of ground operations, a man named Raymond Burke, who had been with the company for 11 years, and whose signature appeared on a great many documents, and whose actual expertise lay primarily in logistics. Daniel read the sign-off sheet in the break room, put it back on the clipboard, drank the rest of his coffee. He had a very specific feeling then. Not alarm. Something more like the knowledge of mathematics, the certainty that a series of numbers, arranged as they were, would eventually reach a particular sum. He went to find Tommy. Tommy. The G700 FBW feedback error. Danny, it's still showing. I checked the data pull from last night's idle diagnostic. The variance between primary and backup channels is 0.3 milliseconds and rising. That's not incidental. Tommy looked at him with tired patience. Burke signed it off. Burke doesn't know what he's signing. That is not a sentence that is ever going to come out of your mouth in this facility again. Do you understand me? Daniel understood him. He went back to work. The G700 sat in the hangar, and it was quiet and beautiful, and it contained, in its left lateral control surface feedback circuit, a fault that was not a fault, or rather, it was a fault that had been designed by neglect to look like the absence of a fault. Daniel would think later about the moment when he could have stopped it. He would try to locate a clear decision point. A hinge he had not turned. He would have a hard time finding it. What he found instead was the memory of Emma's voice. Fixing them is more important, I think. He had not disagreed. He went back to work and he waited. At 8:51 a.m., the Gulfstream G700 was fully fueled, fully loaded, and entirely stopped. Not metaphorically. Not in any administrative sense. The starboard engine had wound up, then the port engine had wound up, and then the flight management computer had received a signal from the FBW control surface feedback circuit, a signal that fell precisely in the gap between what the primary channel acknowledged and what the backup channel would accept, and the entire fly-by-wire system had gone into safe lockdown mode. Both engines spooled down simultaneously. The sound was distinctive. Anyone who had spent time around turbofan aircraft knew the difference between a controlled spool down and an emergency one. A controlled spool down had a tapering quality, a deceleration with a kind of finality. This one had that quality with an additional note underneath it, a brief high-frequency oscillation in the fuel management system as it was cut, and then there was nothing. The silence on the runway was immediate and absolute. Victoria Aldridge was in the main cabin, reviewing the Hartwell briefing documents on a tablet, and the silence informed her in the way that only the absence of expected noise can. Something was precisely wrong. She had flown enough, and owned enough aircraft, and spent enough time around engineers who spoke the language of systems to know that this was not the silence of a decision. This was the silence of a refusal, the aircraft's own intelligence refusing to do what it had been told, until someone explained, in the specific mathematical vocabulary it understood, why it was wrong to refuse. She knew the difference. The difference mattered. Preston came back from the forward galley. He didn't say anything. His expression said it. She was already moving. On the tarmac, the ground crew had gone still. The flight captain, a man named Douglas Wren, with 22 years of Gulfstream experience, stood at the base of the air stairs with his hands in his pockets, and the look of a man doing rapid internal calculations. He spoke quietly into his headset. He listened again. He took his headset off. That gesture, the headset coming off, the slight rotation of the neck, the look toward the middle distance was the gesture of a man who had just been told something that put him outside the category of solutions he was qualified to apply. That was when Victoria reached the tarmac. She came down the stairs in measured steps. She was not someone who ran, not visibly, not in front of a crew, and she crossed to Ren with her arms at her sides. "Tell me," she said. "FBW lockdown," Ren said. "Full system, both channels. Override? Not available in safe mode. The computer won't accept manual until... How long to get an avionics team here? Clearwater doesn't have a certified G-Series team on site. We'd be looking at..." He paused to take a call. Listened. "The closest Gulfstream certified crew is in Atlanta. Minimum 4 hours." Victoria looked at the plane. The Zurich window was 9 a.m. local. The Hartwell team had cleared their morning for a live demonstration. $340 million in contracts, and at the table on the other side. Two competing firms, who had been told, with some degree of accuracy, that Aldridge Aviation's avionics suite was demonstrably superior, but who had not yet signed anything. Superiority was a claim that required presence. A video conference was not presence. A delay of 4+ hours, compounded by transatlantic time zones and the logistics of rescheduling 20 people across 2 continents, was not a delay. It was an absence. And in the specific grammar of negotiation at that level, an absence was the same as a concession. She turned to Burke, who had appeared at her elbow with the expression of a man who was very focused on not being the cause of whatever this was. "Where is the Atlanta team?" "Currently on." "How long?" 4 hours. Minimum. Weather out of Hartsfield. "So we have nothing." Burke had no good answer for this. He produced the facial expression of a man thinking very hard about answers and coming up empty, which was an expression Daniel Carter, watching from the hangar bay window, had seen on many faces over the years, and which told him exactly the same thing every time. The tarmac held its silence. Inside the hangar, Daniel Carter had watched the engines spool down through the bay window. He had watched them from the moment the windup began, because he had been waiting for it in the way you wait for something you have already calculated. Not hoping for it, not wanting it. Simply knowing, with the quiet certainty of arithmetic, that a specific set of conditions would produce a specific result. He had watched the captain take off his headset. He watched Victoria Aldridge come down the stairs. He picked up his radio, put it back, walked to the hangar door, stopped. There was a version of this where he stayed where he was, where he clocked out at 3 p.m. and drove the Camry to Emma's school, and picked her up and went to the grocery store and bought pasta, and the specific brand of marinara sauce she preferred, and made dinner, and that was the day. A complete day. A good day, even, in the specific way that simple days are good. He had been building that version carefully for 3 years. It had a particular texture to it, small, stable, Emma-shaped, and it was real, and it was his, and he was not going to give it up for a dramatic gesture, or a point proven, or an apology he hadn't asked for. But the plane was sitting on the runway, with a fault he knew how to fix. And the fault had been there in the log with his name on it for 36 hours. And the woman whose plane it was standing on the tarmac looking at it the way you look at a problem when you have run out of the kind of people who are supposed to solve it. He had once believed that doing the right thing was a system. That if you flagged the fault and documented the finding and followed the process would produce the correct outcome. He had held that belief with the thoroughness of someone who had been trained in engineering, which was a field that rewarded rigor and punished hand-waving. The system had failed. He had adjusted, but the fault was still there. And a fault that he knew how to fix and chose not to fix was no longer the system's failure. He opened the hangar door and walked toward the plane. He was 30 feet from the air stairs when Burke saw him. "Carter." Burke's voice had the texture of a warning. "This is not a maintenance support situation. You need to go back to, I know what the fault is." Silence. Burke looked at him. "Excuse me?" "The FBW lockdown. I know what caused it. I logged it yesterday. Input handling misalignment between the primary and backup channels. The variance crossed the lockdown threshold during windup. It's not a hardware failure. It's a configuration error in the feedback timing calibration." Burke's jaw moved without producing words. 3 feet away, Victoria Aldridge was looking at Daniel Carter for the first time that morning, without the benefit of distance or amusement. He was, she noted, the same man who had owned the car. He was standing on her tarmac in a gray button-down and work boots, and he was speaking about her aircraft with a specificity that did not come from a maintenance support position. "Who are you?" she said. "Daniel Carter. I'm on Tommy Reeves' crew. I understand that. I'm asking who you are. I know what's wrong with your plane." She held his gaze for a moment. She had built a company from a graduate thesis and a borrowed server rack, and she had learned in that process to identify the specific quality of a person who was telling the truth, as opposed to a person who was performing the truth. They felt different. The performing kind had a slight forward lean to them. A salesmanship. This man was not leaning. "You have 5 minutes," she said. "The cockpit is open." Burke started to speak. She looked at him. He stopped. Daniel went up the stairs. The cockpit of the G700 was quiet and dim, all instruments dark in safe mode. He sat in the first officer's seat, not the captain's. He noticed the small decision she would read in that, and he looked at the FMC display. He did not touch anything immediately. He sat, and he looked. Captain Wren was standing behind the jump seat, watching. Preston was watching from the galley doorway. 3 members of the ground crew had climbed the air stairs out of something that was not quite curiosity and not quite protocol. Daniel read the fault log on the FMC. He read the parameter display. He pulled up the secondary diagnostics screen and read those. He said, "Somebody modified the feedback timing table." Wren said, "What?" The calibration file for the FBW backup channel timing someone wrote a value of 480 microseconds, where the specification calls for 360. It's in the tertiary parameter set. It wouldn't show in a standard walkthrough. It only becomes active when the primary channel variance exceeds a certain threshold at high power, which only happens at engine windup. The cockpit was very quiet. Daniel looked at the fault log dates. He looked at them again. "This modification was made 18 days ago," he said. After the last certified maintenance inspection, he did not say the next logical sentence out loud. The logical sentence was, "Someone put it there." He had learned, over 3 years, that sentences that rearranged the world required more than a cockpit and 5 minutes. He looked at Wren. "I can restore the original calibration file from the aircraft's backup partition. It takes about 22 minutes if I have access to the maintenance terminal." Wren looked over his shoulder. Victoria Aldridge was standing in the cockpit doorway. She was very still. "Do it," she said. 22 minutes is a long time when $340 million is on the other side of it. Daniel worked without speaking. He had the maintenance terminal connected to the avionics bus, and the cockpit around him was populated with a careful stillness. Wren, Preston, one of the security detail, a ground crew chief named Lena Marsh, who had been with Clearwater for 9 years, and who stood with her arms folded and watched Daniel's hands with an expression that was recalibrating itself in real time. He typed. He navigated. He did not look at any of them. Victoria Aldridge stood in the doorway. She had told Preston to call Zurich and manage the delay. She had told Burke to stay on the tarmac, which was both a logistical direction and a statement. She had stayed because she was not someone who left the room when something important was happening in it. She watched Daniel Carter's hands. They were precise, not fast in the showing-off sense, but efficient in the way that engineering precision is efficient, no wasted motion, no searching. Every action confirming a decision that had already been made. He knew this terminal. He knew these systems. He knew them in the way that you know something you built yourself. "There," he said. He sat back slightly. Not dramatically, not with announcement. He said there the way you say it when you are confirming something to yourself rather than performing for an audience. Wren leaned forward and read the screen. "Calibration restored," he said. "Backup channel timing, 360 microseconds, consistent with..." He stopped. "This matches the original factory spec exactly. It is the original factory file," Daniel said. "Pulled from the backup partition. The modified version is still in the directory if you want to document it." "We'll want to document it," Wren said. His voice had changed in a way that took the word document out of the administrative category and put it somewhere more serious. 22 minutes, Victoria said. It was not quite a question. 19, Daniel said. He was already closing the terminal. She watched him stand up, watched him reach for the cable to disconnect the terminal, and she said, "Stop." He stopped. "What's your background?" He looked at her. She was standing in the cockpit doorway of an $8 million aircraft in a charcoal blazer at 9:17 in the morning, and she was asking a question she already suspected the answer to, and needed to have confirmed anyway. "I'm on Tommy Reeves's crew," he said. "That's your current job." "I asked your background." He picked up the cable, coiled it, set it on the seat. "I designed systems like this one," he said. "Among other things." "For who?" He looked at her. "You know who?" he said. She knew. Not immediately, the name Daniel Carter had passed through the memory like a stone through water, something displaced that had settled again without leaving a mark. But she was in the plane now, with the FMC display, showing the restored calibration and the modified file still sitting in the directory like a question waiting to be formally asked, and she was looking at a man whose hands knew Gulfstream avionics at a level that should have been impossible for someone on a ground maintenance crew. She went back to her cabin, and she called her head of corporate records. It took 7 minutes. Then she sat very still for another 4 minutes and looked at the airfield. 5 years ago, Daniel Carter had been the senior systems engineer at Aldridge Aviation's prototype division. He had been one of 4 engineers who built the original FBW feedback architecture that became the foundation of the company's first certified avionics suite. He had been, by internal assessment and external review, the most technically capable person in that group. 18 months into production certification, he had filed an internal report. The report detailed a systematic error in the feedback timing calibration process, not a design flaw, but a documentation failure, a case where the spec as written diverged from the spec as implemented in a way that would not appear in standard testing but would, under specific combinations of ambient temperature, altitude, and power load, produce intermittent control surface lag. The report was accurate. The report was also, at the time it was filed, a catastrophe. The certification process was at a critical juncture. A finding of this magnitude, properly reported to the FAA, would have required a recertification review, a process that would take 18 months minimum and cost the company its primary contract window. The head of certification compliance at the time had been a man named Howard Gill. Howard Gill had a particular talent for making problems disappear through the strategic reassignment of their origin. The report was quietly reclassified as a preliminary internal analysis, subject to further review. The further review was assigned to a committee that met twice and produced a summary that characterized Daniel's findings as a product of instrument calibration error on the test bench rather than a genuine system fault. Daniel's name was on the original report. The summary's counterarguments were attributed to the committee, which was to say, to the institution. The institution's conclusion was that Daniel Carter's methodology was flawed. Daniel was offered a severance package and a non-disclosure agreement. He declined the non-disclosure agreement. He was informed that this was unwise. He declined again. He was let go without severance. His professional certification was not revoked. There were no grounds, but in the specific world of aviation avionics systems, where companies were small and principals were connected, the story that preceded him through the industry was not the story of a principled engineer who had caught a real fault. It was the story of a difficult, possibly unstable engineer who had made a significant error and could not accept the correction. He found contract work, then smaller contract work. Then his wife, who had married an engineer with a career trajectory and found herself married to a man rebuilding himself from parts, looked at the situation clearly and decided that she loved him, but that love had requirements she was not able to lower. She left on a Tuesday. Emma was 3. He moved to Clearwater 6 months ago because Tommy Reeves was his father's cousin, and Tommy had a job, and the job was something, and something was what you needed before you could build toward more. Victoria Aldridge read the internal file. Then the dismissal record. Then the supplementary note from Howard Gill, which was still in the system, which characterized Daniel Carter's behavior as potentially disruptive and resistant to peer oversight. Howard Gill was now the head of compliance for her company's Southeast Regional Division. She read the note 3 more times. Then she called Preston. "Tell Zurich we'll make the 11 a.m. slot," she said. "And tell Raymond Burke I need to see him before I board." The Zurich meeting happened. The Hartwell contract was signed. $340 million moved in the formal, unhurried way of institutional money, and Aldridge Aviation's avionics suite was certified as the preferred platform for the next generation of American defense auxiliary aircraft. 2 weeks later, a preliminary investigation into the G700 avionics modification was opened. The aircraft maintenance log, the terminal access records, and the modified calibration file were all submitted to the company's legal team and, separately, to the FAA's Avionics Certification Office. The investigation found that the modification had been made remotely through a maintenance terminal access session using credentials that had been issued to Raymond Burke. Burke's account was that his credentials had been used without his knowledge. This account was not supported by the access log timestamps, which aligned with a period when Burke had been the only person with physical access to the designated terminal. Burke resigned 3 weeks into the investigation. The internal review that followed the resignation found 2 additional parameter modifications in the system archives, both in avionics documents that had originated in the period 5 years earlier, in the period when the original certification process had been at its critical juncture. Both modifications were small. Both were in timing tables. Both diverged from the factory specification in the exact direction that would have made Daniel Carter's original report look less accurate than it was. Daniel was informed of the findings by a lawyer he had hired on a payment plan. He sat in his kitchen at the table where Emma did her homework, and he read the findings document. And he did not feel vindicated in the way that movies suggested you felt vindicated. He felt something quieter and more complicated, which was close to grief for the version of things that might have been, mixed with a kind of very specific exhaustion. He made pasta. Emma told him about a project she was doing at school about clouds. He listened carefully. Victoria Aldridge arrived at Clearwater on a Thursday morning, unannounced, with 1 car instead of 3. She found Daniel in the hangar. He was calibrating a navigation sensor unit for a citation that was due for its annual inspection. He heard her come in, and he did not stop what he was doing. She stood and watched for a moment. "I owe you an apology," she said. He finished the calibration sequence. "Set the unit on the workbench." "The car," he said. The junkyard comment. "That and other things." He turned around and leaned against the workbench with his arms folded. And he looked at her with those blue eyes that were not hostile and not warm and simply attentive. "You want to offer me a job," he said. "A position," she said. "Senior Director of Systems Integrity. You'd oversee the entire certification compliance architecture, full authority over the documentation process, direct access to the legal team, reporting to the board rather than internal compliance." She paused, and a formal acknowledgement that the report you filed 5 years ago was accurate and actionable, and that the response to it was a violation of the professional standards you were owed. The hangar was quiet. The citation sat in its bay. Light came through the high windows at a shallow angle. "What's the salary?" he said. She told him. He was quiet for a moment. "That's a fair number," he said. "I thought so. I'm declining it." She waited. "The acknowledgement I want that," he said. "Not for me. For the record. Because the FBW feedback fault is going to come up again in some form. Somewhere. And the paper trail needs to reflect what actually happened." He met her eyes. "But I don't want the job. May I ask why?" He picked up the sensor unit and set it on the calibration rack. 3 years ago, I was trying to decide whether to spend what was left of my savings on legal fees or on stability for my daughter. I chose stability. He was looking at the sensor unit as he spoke, not at her, but his voice was level and exact. "I took a contract role, then I took a lower contract role. Then I took this." He gestured at the hangar without any particular emphasis. "I didn't do that because I gave up. I did it because you play the board in front of you, and now I'm offering you a different board. Now you're offering me the board I would have had if the process had worked the way it was supposed to work." He finally looked at her. "That's not the same as the board I built." She was quiet for a long moment. "Then tell me what you want," she said. Not the job, not the salary. What you want. He said it simply, without theatrics, like someone who had been thinking about it for a while and had arrived, through careful consideration, at a conclusion that had the quality of inevitability rather than inspiration. He said, I want the company to change how it handles internal technical reports. What he wanted, he explained, was a structural change in how the company's internal reporting system worked. He had thought about this carefully over the weeks since the investigation had concluded, in the way that he thought about all engineering problems, with attention to mechanism rather than symptom. The symptom was that his report had been suppressed. The mechanism was that internal compliance reports flowed through a chain that had economic interests attached to their conclusions. Howard Gill had suppressed the report because Howard Gill's department's performance metrics were tied to certification timeline. Burke had modified the parameter files, the investigation's conclusion, now nearly certain because he was protecting something that investigation was still untangling. The mechanism made the symptom inevitable. You want an independent compliance channel, Victoria said. I want a compliance structure where the people who receive the reports have no financial stake in their conclusions. Separate from operations, separate from certification. Reporting to an external board with published metrics. He paused. And I want whistleblower protection written into the employment contract at every level, not as a policy document, as a contractual term. She was looking at him with an expression he had not seen from her before. It was attentive in a different way than her usual attentiveness, which was strategic. This was something more like respect, which had a different quality it didn't calculate. That's a significant structural change, she said. Yes, it will cost more than your salary would have. I know. Why do you care? She asked it directly, not unkindly. You've been vindicated. You could take the settlement, there will be a settlement, and walk away from this industry entirely. He picked up his thermos from the workbench. The same thermos she had seen that first morning, scratched aluminum, faded Clearwater logo on the side. Because someone else is going to file a report somewhere, he said. And they're going to be 28, and they're going to have a kid at home, and they're going to be looking at the same choice I was looking at, and I want the system to work when they do. She was quiet. Also, he said, with a slight adjustment in his voice, that was the closest thing she had heard to Rye from him. I'm your second largest individual shareholder. So, I have an interest in the company not having any more mornings like that one on the runway. She had known this. The records had shown it, a quiet accumulation of shares over 3 years, purchased through a private investment account, built from the settlements he had quietly negotiated and the contract income he had not spent, and a specific, methodical patience. She had known it, and she had come here anyway, and the offer had been genuine. That told her something about herself that she was still working through. 5%, she said. 5.3, he said. She looked at him. Something crossed her face that might have been the beginning of a smile. When did you start buying? She asked. 2 months after you let me go, he said. I thought if I couldn't change it from the inside, I'd change it from the outside. He paused. It takes a while. But it works. The restructuring took 4 months. It was not smooth. Restructurings rarely are. There were board meetings where voices were raised, and there were exit interviews with people who had done the raising, and there were several conversations between Victoria Aldridge and Daniel Carter that happened in conference rooms, and then, gradually, in the less formal setting of the company cafeteria, over coffee, with the specific quality of 2 people who had looked at each other across a very clear conflict, and had both, separately, decided to stop fighting it. The Independent Compliance Division was established in the 7th month. Its first director was a woman named Sandra Okafor, who had previously worked in aviation safety oversight for the NTSB and had the particular quality of someone who had spent a career caring about the right things with precision. The whistleblower protection clause was written into every employment contract at the company. The FAA review of the original certification process was opened. The findings, when they came, were technical and careful and public, and they confirmed what Daniel's report had said 5 years before. Howard Gill was not charged with anything. The investigation concluded that the suppression, while a serious professional failure, did not constitute a criminal act. He resigned before the report was published. Daniel read that part of the findings and was quiet about it for a long time. Ren, who had stayed in contact, asked him how he felt. Like a person who built a bridge, Daniel said. I don't need to throw the old one in the river. It's just not the bridge anymore. Ren thought about this. That's a very calm way to feel about it. I've got a kid to pick up from school, Daniel said. On the last Friday of November, Victoria Aldridge drove to Clearwater Elementary School. She had a meeting in the area, a genuine one, not a pretext, and she had left early without entirely being able to explain to Preston why, and she was parked outside the school at 3:15 when the doors opened and the students came out in the particular organized chaos of a school release. She was not certain what she expected to see. She had never watched a school release before. She had not been the kind of child who remembered being one. She saw Daniel Carter first. He was standing at the edge of the sidewalk in a dark jacket, hands in his pockets, and he was watching the door with the specific quality of attention that she had come to recognize as his default register, complete and undemonstrative. Then the girl came out. She was 8, small, with her father's eyes. She was carrying a backpack that was approximately the same size as she was, and wearing a jacket that had a small painted airplane on the left shoulder, the kind of painted detail a parent might have added with fabric paint on a Sunday afternoon. She saw her father, and she launched herself at him with the uncomplicated velocity of a child who has never needed to make herself smaller. He caught her, lifted her, pressed his face briefly against the top of her head, then set her down and took the enormous backpack from her and slung it over his own shoulder in one motion. And Emma said something that made him smile, and it was a different face when he smiled. Victoria thought, not less serious but more complete. Emma looked around, spotted Victoria's car, looked at her through the windshield with the frank appraisal of a child who has not yet learned that staring is considered impolite. Victoria, without quite deciding to, rolled down the window. Emma approached. "Are you the airplane lady?" she said. Victoria looked at Daniel. He was watching this with his arms at his sides. "I suppose I am," Victoria said. "My dad fixed your airplane," Emma said. "The one that wouldn't work." "He did," Victoria said. Emma considered this. She had her father's quality of thinking before speaking. But she had, additionally, the willingness to say the thing she was thinking. "He fixes things," she said. "That's what he does, not just airplanes." Victoria looked at the girl for a moment. "I know," she said. "I noticed." Emma looked satisfied by this. She turned back to her father. "Can we get the pasta with the crunchy stuff tonight? The breadcrumbs?" "Yes, we can get the breadcrumbs." She took his hand. They walked toward the Camry, which was parked at the end of the sidewalk, slightly more battered than it had been that morning on the Clearwater tarmac. The same wire, on the same exhaust pipe, Emma's crayon drawing still in the rear window. Victoria watched them go. He had a board meeting on Monday. The compliance restructuring would be on the agenda for formal vote. Ren had agreed to testify to the FAA panel about what he had witnessed in the cockpit, the modified file, the timestamps, the specific character of the fault. Sandra Okafor had 3 candidates for her deputy director role and had asked Daniel to review the technical portions of their assessments, which he had done on a Tuesday evening at the kitchen table while Emma did homework beside him, and he had made notes in the margins in the same mechanical pencil he used for everything, and Emma had said, "What are you writing?" And he had said, "Work stuff," and she had said, "I thought you were a fixer, not a writer." And he had said, "Sometimes fixing things requires a lot of writing first," and she had thought about this seriously for several seconds and then returned to her homework. Things were in motion. Things were being built. The kind of building that doesn't have a ribbon-cutting ceremony that accretes through signed documents and careful notes and small decisions made correctly in private. The kind of building that you only recognize as finished in retrospect when you turn around and find that the structure is already load-bearing. The drawing was new. He had left the old one in place, and Emma had added to it a second airplane, larger now, with careful proportions. And underneath it the same enormous lettering, "Dad's work." Victoria sat in her car for a while after they had driven away. She had built a company from a graduate thesis. She had signed contracts in 7 countries. She had been in rooms full of powerful people, and she had generally been the most capable person in them, and she had not been wrong about that. She thought about the morning on the runway, the way he had walked out of the hangar without announcement, the way he had said there when the calibration restored, the way he had declined the job not with drama or with point scoring, but with the clean simplicity of a person who knew exactly what they had built and did not need a different building. She thought about Emma's voice. He fixes things. That's what he does. She thought, yes, and he fixed something here that I did not know was broken. She put the car in drive. She thought, as she pulled onto the road and joined the flow of late afternoon traffic, about a word she had not used in many years. The word was accountability. She had used it in the corporate sense for a long time: accountability for results, accountability for timelines, accountability for margin, which was a version of the word that had been hollowed out so thoroughly by professional use that it no longer carried any weight. It was the word you said in board meetings, when what you meant was, someone will answer for this. But accountability in its older sense, the one she was thinking about now, was different. It was not about someone answering for something. It was about being answerable, present to the consequences of your decisions in a way that you couldn't delegate or restructure or reframe. Daniel Carter had been accountable in that sense for 3 years. Accountable to Emma, accountable to the legal pad in the drawer with the fault parameters written in his own hand. Evidence that he had known and documented and not let himself forget. Accountable to the record he wanted corrected, not for himself but for the next person who would need it. She had not been accountable in that way. She had been responsible, which was different, which was about ownership of outcomes rather than presence to process, and she had been capable and driven and right about most things in the technical domain. But the thing that had happened 5 years ago, under her roof, with her name on the company, she had not been present to that. She had received the summary and read engineer's methodology flawed, and had filed it in the category of a problem that had been resolved. She had not asked, who was in the room when this conclusion was reached? She asked it now, in retrospect, 4 years too late and 3 months too early to call it finished. She asked it knowing the answer, and she drove home in the ordinary early evening traffic, with the specific weight of a person who has correctly identified something they cannot undo, and must, therefore, carry differently. That was the day she called Sandra Okafor. There is a particular kind of power that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need the 3 black SUVs, or the charcoal blazer, or the name in the business press. It doesn't even need the recognition, though the recognition is useful and sometimes just. It sits in a beat-up Camry, and drives to school and makes pasta with breadcrumbs on Friday nights, and buys shares in companies quietly for 3 years, and waits for the board to arrange itself. It speaks, when it speaks, with precision, and when the sky needs fixing, it walks out of the hangar in a gray button-down and work boots, and it fixes the sky, and then it goes home.